This afternoon we're going to make for you Jim Lay's no-knead bread. This is Peter assisting in the background. And this is the easiest bread of all time to make, and it makes beautiful, chewy bread with big air holes in it, and it's delicious and it's so easy you'll never go back. It's better than bakery bread. All you need is a good set of scales, and you need some plain white baker's flour, so that's strong flour. Wholemeal plain flour. This is a funny container, but it's actually just got salt and some yeast. I'm going to make one now that's half and half plain and wholemeal. So I'm going to put in 200 grams, which is about 1 heaped cup of plain baker's flour. And 200 grams of wholemeal plain flour. And then I add a good pinch of salt, depending on how salty you like your bread, but I usually put in a good pinch of salt and just 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. It's all the yeast you use. And then I give it a bit of a mix. I put my scales back to 0 and I add 300 grams or 300 mils of water. You don't need any more weighing, so that's all the weighing done. And then I mix it. You don't have to mix it too much. You know, so I'm not actually kneading it, but I just want to try and make sure that all the flour and water is incorporated. So you don't want kind of too much dry flour sitting around. So you just give it a good mix until it's looking a bit doughy. But I'm not trying to knead it, so that's enough. Just until you've got everything all sort of mixed together. And I just scrape that off. And let it sit for 24 hours. I put a lid on it, but I don't stick the lid down because it needs to be able to breathe a bit, but you just want a lid on it just to keep dust and stuff out. And then you put that away and leave that for 24 hours. In hot summer, 12 hours might be enough, but in winter, it needs 24 hours. Now luckily, I've got a little something I prepared earlier. So this is the dough that we made last night. So now it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so it hasn't sat for quite as long as it normally would. It's but you can see how it's still got this. If I pull it up a bit like that, you can see how all the gluten strands have come to, so it's as though it had been kneaded, because you've got all that nice gluten strand formation. Normally when you make old-fashioned bread, where you knead it, it's the kneading that puts the gluten strands all in alignment with each other. When you make this bread, it has a much higher water to flour ratio, and so that high water to flour ratio means that actually the dough is wet enough that the gluten strands can all just naturally form into alignment, and that's what makes the bread chewy, and it gives a very good crumb, so that when you bite into it, it has that nice Italian strong texture. I just put some flour on the table. When I'm doing that, I turn the oven on to preheat, and in the oven I've got a heavy cast iron pot that can seal with a lid. And this is really important because you have to seal the bread for the first part of baking in a pot, and that means that all the moisture gets trapped in there, and that gives the bread a really thick crust. So in other forms of baking, people spray the bread or have other ways of putting moisture to make it get a nice crust. This bread does it itself because there's enough moisture in the dough that when you put it in a sealed pot, it makes steam that then gives the good crust on the bread. So I've got my pot, I stick it in the oven, but it has to get very hot. So I've got my oven set to 250, and I let it preheat for about half an hour. And I use a Le Creuset cast iron pot. Sometimes I double the recipe. When I double the recipe, I use our big camp oven. I think cast iron is probably the best way to do it because you want something that's going to be able to really retain the heat. When you pull the pot out, I'll show you later, you pull the pot out and put the dough in, you see the dough kind of spring with the heat. I think if you had something cast iron it would be better, but if you haven't got anything like that, try it in a Pyrex thing with a lid and see if it works. While the oven's preheating and the pot's in the oven preheating, I'm going to scrape my bread dough out and just put it into, I'm going to shape it into a loaf. Once again, I don't knead it at all. I just scrape it. Try and keep it as much in one piece as you can. And then we just need to stretch it a little bit just to make it, once again, we want all those gluten strands to be nice and straight. So just with a bit of flour on your hands, just pick your dough up. You don't want to stretch it too much because you don't want to break the gluten strands. So you just want them stretched out and nicely aligned, something like that. Once I've done that, I usually just kind of roll it up. So I just fold, and roll the whole thing up so it ends up into a nice round loaf shape. It's going to about double in size when it's in the oven. So that's about half the size of the loaf we're going to get in the end. Once you've got a nice shape and you're happy with your shape, just grab out a clean tea towel. I say a clean tea towel, but to be quite honest, when we started making this bread, we used to get a clean tea towel out every time and I got sick of washing my tea towels. So now what I do is I get one and it goes for a few days or sometimes a week. And I just keep using the same floury tea towel over and over again for making my bread. Put a little bit of flour on your tea towel. Pick up your bread. I've got this groovy device. This is a baker's scraper. It just makes cleaning up much easier when you are making lots of bread because you can scrape all the flour and dough off the bench. And I scrape that up and just cover the loaf with a bit of flour. And then you want to fold it into the tea towel so that as it rises, because it's still going to do about another half hour of rising, and what you want is as it rises, you really want it to keep that nice loaf shape. If I just left it sitting on the bench like that, it would all kind of spread and flatten out and make it difficult to get it in the pot. So you wrap it up in the tea towel so that it holds its shape, like that. And then you just let it sit there for half an hour. So we'll have to come back in half an hour once the pot is hot and I'll show you what to do next. So the pot has been heating up in the oven now for about half an hour. Sometimes 20 minutes is enough. This one's been in for half an hour. And you can see, even looking at it, that the pot is boiling hot. So you always have to make sure you've got your oven mitts at hand. I always put it onto a breadboard like that and then lift the lid off. This is my bread that's been sitting here just resting and rising. This is always a little bit messy, but ready? And you just gently pop it in like that and watch how the bread just spring. You can see it's alive, and if you touch it you can see it's really nicely holding its shape. So you quickly pop the lid back on again and that makes it all closed in that system. So like I was saying before, the steam will come out of the bread and give it a nice crunchy crust. And then you pop it back in the oven and set the timer for half an hour, 30 minutes. And we'll be back in 30 minutes. Alright, so we're coming back to our bread. Half an hour has gone past. The buzzer's just gone to let me know that it's time to take the lid off. So we open the oven carefully because it's all very hot. I never take it out. I just slip in and take the lid off. And there you can just have a quick look at what the bread looks like already. But now it needs about another 5 or 10 minutes to make it really look brown and crusty. So I just shut it back in again. Put the timer on for 10 more minutes. And we'll be back in 10 minutes. Alright, so my oven's just buzzed again. That tells me the bread's ready. So I'm just going to open up the oven. And what I normally do now is I actually leave the pot in the oven and just get the bread out. and pop it on a little rack. So there's our finished product. And although it smells beautiful and you want to cut into it straight away, you can't. You have to wait for the bread to cool, because otherwise when you cut the bread, you'll get you get quite moist crumb that sticks to the knife, and it's just always disappointing. So even though it's really hard, you have to wait, or else you'll cut into it and think, oh, this bread feels a bit soggy. It's not really soggy, but it does need to cool. And if you listen to it in a minute, as it starts to cool, the bread sings to you, and you can hear it cracking and hissing and singing as it cools down. So you can't cut it until it's cool. But we do have some bread that we made earlier. So this bread's not warm, but you can see how you get nice holes in the bread. But it's a crusty, chewy, it's got, if I take one of the pieces like this, it's got that chewy Italian crumb. This one's got linseed in it. You can do whatever you like, basically. You can use spelt flour, rye flour, adder flour. You can make it a higher proportion of wholemeal or lower proportion of wholemeal. You can make just plain baker's flour, and if you do that, it tastes just like that Italian, like a baguette kind of loaf. You can put nuts or seeds in. Go crazy, experiment. You can't go wrong. And like I say, it's not my bread, it's Jim Lay's bread, L-E-A-H-Y. He's got a website. He's an American baker. I've never met him, but I'd love to meet him because I think his bread is fantastic. So this is easy peasy, no knead bread making. Beautiful with a little bit of butter on it. And please try this, because we started making this bread a year ago and we've made a loaf every single day since, and we've never been disappointed. So I don't think there's any way you can go wrong.